New York, 1952. Nobody entered Frank Costello's office uninvited. Those who did rarely walked out alive. The Prime Minister of the underworld conducted his business from a penthouse on Central Park West, surrounded by men who had killed more people than they could remember. Politicians feared him. Judges obeyed him. Police commissioners took his phone calls at 3 in the morning. Frank Costello didn't just run the Italian Mafia in New York. He owned the entire city. Every gambling operation, every union, every construction project paid tribute to his organization. But there was one neighborhood that refused to bend, Harlem, and there was one man who stood between Costello and the millions of dollars flowing through those streets every single week. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. The streets called him Bumpy. That night, Bumpy Johnson pushed open the door to Costello's office without knocking. He carried no weapon. He brought no bodyguards, just himself and those cold, calculating eyes that had made dangerous men reconsider their life choices. Costello's 5 armed soldiers immediately surrounded him, hands reaching for their pistols. Bumpy didn't even flinch. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a single envelope, and placed it gently on the mahogany desk. Frank Costello stared at the envelope for a long moment before picking it up. His face revealed nothing as he examined its contents. But the men who knew him well, the men who had watched him negotiate with senators and order executions with the same flat expression, noticed something they had never seen before: uncertainty. Inside that envelope were photographs, 12 of them. Each one showed a different member of Costello's organization, meeting with known police informants. Exposed. Vulnerable. One phone call to the district attorney's office, and half of Costello's operation would crumble overnight. Bumpy remained standing perfectly still while Costello processed what he was seeing. The armed men kept their weapons trained on the intruder, waiting for the order that would end his life. But Costello raised his hand slowly, signaling them to hold. He understood what Bumpy was doing. This wasn't a threat. This was a demonstration. Bumpy Johnson had walked into the most dangerous room in New York City completely unarmed, carrying information that could destroy an empire. He was showing Costello something that guns and money couldn't buy: intelligence, preparation, the willingness to play chess while everyone else played checkers. Costello set the photographs down and looked at Bumpy with new eyes. To understand why this moment mattered, you need to understand what Harlem meant in 1952. The neighborhood wasn't just a collection of streets and buildings north of Central Park. It was a kingdom, a self-contained world where Black Americans had built their own economy, their own culture, their own power structure in a country that denied them everything else. At the heart of this kingdom was the numbers racket, the illegal lottery that gave poor folks a chance to dream. You could bet a nickel on a 3-digit number. If your number hit, you won 500 times your bet. For people earning $7 a week scrubbing floors or washing dishes, that nickel wasn't gambling. It was hope. And hope, in Harlem, was worth more than gold. The numbers racket generated hundreds of thousands of dollars every week, all of it flowing through Harlem streets, handled by black runners, controlled by black bankers, protected by black enforcers. The Italian Mafia had tried to take this business before. In the early 1930s, a vicious gangster named Dutch Schultz had muscled his way into Harlem with guns and violence. He had terrorized the neighborhood, murdered competitors, and tried to crush anyone who resisted. But Dutch Schultz had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated a young enforcer working for the numbers queen herself. Stephanie St. Clair was a Caribbean immigrant who had built a numbers empire through sheer will and brilliant strategy. They called her Madam Queen. When Dutch Schultz came for her operation, she turned to her most trusted soldier. Bumpy Johnson was 25 years old, fresh from serving time in prison, and absolutely fearless. He had grown up fighting in the streets of Charleston, South Carolina, before migrating north to Harlem as a teenager. Prison had educated him. not just in violence but in literature, philosophy, and the art of strategic thinking. Bumpy read Shakespeare behind bars. He studied Sun Tzu. He learned that the most dangerous weapon a man could possess wasn't a gun or a knife. It was his mind. When Dutch Schultz sent his killers into Harlem, Bumpy sent them back broken. When Schultz tried to bribe local politicians, Bumpy had better connections. When Schultz threatened business owners, Bumpy protected them. The war lasted years. It cost dozens of lives. And in the end, Dutch Schultz was gunned down in a Newark tavern in October 1935, murdered by the same criminal organization he had once served. Harlem remained independent, and Bumpy Johnson emerged as its undisputed protector. Now, 17 years later, Frank Costello wanted what Dutch Schultz had failed to take. But Costello was smarter than Schultz. Much smarter. He hadn't risen to control the most powerful crime family in America by making the same mistakes as dead men. Costello understood that you couldn't conquer Harlem with guns alone. The neighborhood was too unified, too loyal to its own leaders. Every time the Italian mob sent soldiers into those streets, they faced resistance from an entire community. Shopkeepers who suddenly went blind when asked about criminal activities. Cab drivers who got lost when transporting mob enforcers. Telephone operators who mysteriously disconnected important calls. Harlem protected its own, and the man they protected most fiercely was Bumpy Johnson. Costello had studied his opponent carefully. He knew that Bumpy wasn't just a gangster. He was a community leader who paid rent for struggling families, covered hospital bills for sick children, and made sure elderly residents had food on their tables. Bumpy had built something the Italian mob couldn't understand, loyalty that money couldn't buy, respect that violence couldn't compel, a kingdom held together not by fear, but by genuine love. Costello realized that killing Bumpy wouldn't solve his problem. It would create a martyr. 40,000 people would take to the streets. The resulting chaos would draw federal attention that nobody wanted. There had to be another way. That's why Costello had arranged this meeting, not to threaten Bumpy Johnson, but to negotiate with him, man to man, equal to equal. It was an unprecedented gesture in the history of organized crime. No Italian mob boss had ever sat down with a black gangster as an equal partner. The hierarchy of the underworld mirrored the hierarchy of American society. Black criminals worked for white criminals, or they worked alone. They didn't negotiate at the same table. But Bumpy Johnson had made that impossible. He controlled something Costello wanted, and he couldn't be bought, intimidated, or eliminated. So Costello had swallowed his pride and extended an invitation. Now Bumpy stood in his office, having just demonstrated that he possessed information capable of destroying Costello's carefully constructed empire. The photographs weren't a threat. They were credentials. Bumpy was proving that he had the intelligence network, the resources, and the strategic vision to be a worthy partner, rather than a subordinate. Costello understood the message perfectly. He gestured toward the leather chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Mr. Johnson. Let's talk like gentlemen." Bumpy allowed himself a small smile. It was the first time any Italian mob boss had called him Mr. The two men talked for 3 hours that night. Costello's soldiers stood guard outside the closed door, straining to hear what was being discussed inside. They heard nothing but muffled voices, occasional laughter, and the clink of whiskey glasses. Inside that room, two very different men, from two very different worlds, discovered they had more in common than anyone might have expected. Both had grown up poor. Costello in the slums of Italian Harlem, Bumpy in the segregated streets of Charleston. Both had educated themselves, recognizing that intelligence was the only reliable path to power. Both had survived by being smarter than their enemies rather than simply more violent. And both understood that the old ways of doing business were changing. The world was becoming more complicated. Federal agencies were growing more sophisticated. The days when gangsters could operate with impunity were ending. Survival required adaptation. Costello laid out his concerns plainly. The numbers racket in Harlem was attracting too much attention from federal investigators. If the operation was exposed, it wouldn't just hurt Bumpy. It would provide a roadmap for prosecutors to follow the money all the way to Costello's legitimate businesses. They needed to work together to protect their mutual interests. Bumpy listened carefully, his face betraying nothing. When Costello finished speaking, Bumpy leaned forward in his chair. He explained something that no Italian mobster had ever truly understood about Harlem. The numbers racket wasn't just a business. It was a community institution. It employed hundreds of people who had no other economic opportunities in a segregated America. It provided capital for black-owned businesses that banks refused to finance. It funded churches, schools, and social programs. The money that flowed through the numbers operation didn't disappear into offshore accounts. It circulated through Harlem's economy, keeping families fed and businesses open. Bumpy told Costello that he could not and would not hand over control of this operation to outsiders, but he understood Costello's concerns about federal attention. He proposed a different arrangement. Harlem would remain independent territory under Bumpy's control. In exchange, Bumpy would coordinate with Costello's organization on security matters. They would share intelligence about federal investigations. They would avoid actions that might draw unwanted attention to either operation. And most importantly, they would resolve disputes through negotiation rather than violence. It was an alliance of equals, not a surrender. Costello considered the proposal carefully. It wasn't what he had originally wanted, but it was better than the alternative. The alternative was war, and Costello knew exactly what war with Bumpy Johnson would cost. He had done the calculations before arranging this meeting. To take Harlem by force, he would need to send hundreds of soldiers into hostile territory. Many would die. The violence would make newspaper headlines across the country. Federal agents would swarm into New York, investigating both the Italian mob and the Harlem operation. Politicians who currently looked the other way would be forced to take action. The entire arrangement that kept organized crime profitable would collapse under the weight of public scrutiny. And even if Costello won the war, he would inherit a destroyed kingdom. Harlem's residents would never cooperate with Italian overlords. The numbers runners would disappear. The betting parlors would close. The community that made the operation profitable would evaporate like smoke. Victory would be indistinguishable from defeat. Bumpy had understood this reality long before Costello had. That's why he had walked into this meeting unarmed. He knew that his greatest weapon wasn't a gun or a knife. It was the 40,000 people who would die for him, the entire community that stood behind him. You couldn't kill Bumpy Johnson without killing Harlem itself, and Harlem was simply too valuable to destroy. Frank Costello made his decision. He stood up from his desk and extended his hand. Bumpy rose and shook it firmly. One grip. That was all it took to seal an agreement that would reshape the power structure of New York's underworld for the next 16 years. The photographs that Bumpy had brought were never mentioned again. They had served their purpose, demonstrating that Bumpy possessed the intelligence capabilities to be a valuable ally rather than a vulnerable target. Costello would later tell his closest associates that he had never met a more impressive negotiator. Bumpy Johnson had walked into the most dangerous room in New York, alone and unarmed, and walked out with everything he wanted. That took more than courage. It took genius. Word of the meeting spread through the underworld within days. The details remained secret, but the outcome was clear. Frank Costello, the most powerful mob boss in America, had treated Bumpy Johnson as an equal. He had negotiated rather than demanded. He had compromised rather than conquered. For the first time in the history of American organized crime, a black man had sat at the same table as the Italian Mafia and been respected as a peer. The effects of that night rippled through both worlds. In Harlem, Bumpy's reputation soared to legendary heights. He had done what no one thought possible. He had faced down the Italian mob without firing a single shot and emerged with his kingdom intact. The story was whispered in barbershops and beauty parlors, passed from parents to children, transformed into a lesson about dignity, intelligence, and the power of refusing to bow. Bumpy became more than a gangster in the eyes of his community. He became a symbol, proof that a black man could stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful forces in America and demand respect. In the Italian underworld, the meeting created a new precedent. Other mob families had to acknowledge that Harlem was off limits. Costello's agreement with Bumpy became an unwritten law. Anyone who violated it would face consequences not just from Bumpy's organization, but from Costello himself. The Prime Minister had given his word, and his word was bond. This protection allowed Harlem's numbers operation to flourish throughout the 1950s. Money flowed freely. Businesses thrived. The community prospered in ways that would have been impossible under Italian control. And Bumpy Johnson, the boy from Charleston, who had educated himself in prison, became the undisputed godfather of Harlem. But power always comes with a price. The same federal attention that Costello had worried about eventually found its way to Bumpy's doorstep. In 1952, just months after his meeting with Costello, Bumpy was arrested on narcotics charges. The evidence was questionable, the witnesses unreliable, but the outcome was predetermined. Bumpy Johnson was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He would serve time in some of the harshest facilities in America, including the infamous Alcatraz. Many believed this was the end of Bumpy's reign. With their leader behind bars, surely Harlem would fall to outside forces. Surely the Italian mob would finally take what they had always wanted. But that's not what happened. The agreement Bumpy had forged with Costello held firm even in his absence. Costello honored his word. Italian soldiers stayed out of Harlem. The numbers operation continued under the guidance of Bumpy's trusted lieutenants. And every month, money was sent to Bumpy's wife Mamie, ensuring that his family never wanted for anything. It was an extraordinary demonstration of the respect Bumpy had earned, even from behind bars. Even serving a sentence that might have broken other men, he remained the king of Harlem. The years in prison only enhanced Bumpy's legend. Stories circulated about how he conducted himself behind bars. He read constantly, expanding the education he had begun during his first incarceration. Decades earlier, he maintained correspondence with community leaders, politicians, and even some celebrities who admired his reputation. He refused to be broken by the brutal conditions of federal imprisonment. Guards who expected a violent gangster found instead a dignified, intelligent man who commanded respect without ever raising his voice. Other prisoners, even those who might have challenged him on the outside, treated him with deference. Bumpy Johnson had become something larger than a mere criminal. He had become an idea, the embodiment of black resilience in a system designed to crush it. Meanwhile, Frank Costello faced his own challenges. The 1950s brought increased scrutiny from federal agencies and ambitious politicians seeking to make their names by attacking organized crime. In 1957, Costello survived an assassination attempt that left him wounded but alive. The old order was changing. Younger, more violent mobsters were rising to challenge the established leadership, but through it all, the agreement with Bumpy remained intact. Costello never forgot the man who had walked into his office with nothing but an envelope and walked out with an empire. Bumpy Johnson was released from prison in 1963. He had served 11 years. He was 58 years old, gray-haired, and weathered by time. But his eyes still held that same cold, calculating intelligence that had made Frank Costello pause all those years ago. The Harlem that Bumpy returned to had changed dramatically. The civil rights movement was transforming America. New leaders had emerged. Malcolm X was preaching a message of black pride and self-determination that resonated with the same community that had always supported Bumpy. The old ways of doing business were fading. A new generation was rising. But Bumpy adapted, as he had always adapted. He reconnected with his wife, Mamie, who had waited faithfully through all those years of imprisonment. He reestablished his presence in Harlem's streets, walking through neighborhoods that still remembered him as their protector. And he discovered that his legend had only grown in his absence. Young men who had been children when he went to prison now approached him with reverence, asking for his wisdom, seeking his blessing. Bumpy had become an elder statesman of the streets. Frank Costello had retired from active leadership by the time Bumpy returned. The Prime Minister was in his 70s, living quietly and trying to avoid the federal attention that had plagued his later years. But when word reached him that Bumpy was free, Costello sent a message through intermediaries. The old agreement still stood. Harlem remained independent territory. The respect between them had not diminished with time. Some accounts suggest the two men met one final time in the mid-1960s, not to negotiate or conduct business, but simply to acknowledge what they had built together. Two old warriors from different worlds, sharing a drink and remembering a night when they had changed the rules of the game. Whether this meeting actually occurred remains uncertain, but what is certain is that both men honored their agreement until their dying days. Bumpy Johnson passed away on July 4th, 1968. He was 62 years old. The cause was congestive heart failure. He collapsed at Wells Restaurant on Lenox Avenue, the same establishment where he had held court for decades. His wife Mamie was by his side. The funeral that followed was one of the largest Harlem had ever seen. Thousands of people lined the streets to pay their respects to the Godfather. Frank Costello died 5 years later, in 1973, at the age of 82. He had outlived most of his contemporaries, avoiding the violent deaths that claimed so many of his fellow mobsters. In his final years, when asked about his career, Costello rarely spoke about the crimes, the violence, or the political corruption, but he occasionally mentioned Bumpy Johnson. According to those who knew him in his twilight years, Costello considered Bumpy one of the most impressive men he had ever encountered, not because of his capacity for violence, which was considerable, not because of his wealth, which was substantial, but because of his mind. Bumpy Johnson had understood something that most criminals never grasped. True power came not from fear, but from respect, not from weapons, but from wisdom, not from domination, but from mutual benefit. He had built a kingdom not by crushing his enemies, but by making himself indispensable to his community. He had protected Harlem not by isolation, but by strategic alliance with forces that might otherwise have destroyed it. He had played a weak hand brilliantly, turning disadvantage into strength through pure intellectual superiority. The legacy of that night in Costello's office extended far beyond the two men who shaped it. Their agreement established a model for interracial cooperation in organized crime that had never existed before. It demonstrated that negotiation could succeed where violence failed. It proved that respect could be earned across the boundaries of race and ethnicity, even in the brutal world of the underworld. Most importantly, it showed that a black man could stand as an equal to the most powerful forces in America and demand to be treated with dignity. This was 1952. Segregation was still the law of the land. Black Americans were denied basic civil rights in much of the country. The idea that a black gangster could negotiate as an equal with the Italian Mafia was almost unthinkable. But Bumpy Johnson made it happen through preparation, intelligence, and an unshakable confidence in his own worth. He didn't ask for respect. He commanded it. He didn't beg for fair treatment. He demonstrated that unfair treatment would be costly. He walked into that room with nothing but an envelope and walked out having changed the rules of the game forever. Harlem remembered. Long after Bumpy's death, long after the numbers racket faded into history, the community remembered what he had represented. He was flawed, certainly. He was a criminal who profited from illegal gambling and other enterprises. He was capable of violence when violence was necessary. But he was also a man who had protected his people when no one else would. He had stood between Harlem and the forces that wanted to exploit it. He had used his power to help those who had nothing, the rent payments for struggling families, the hospital bills for sick children, the protection for businesses that would otherwise have been victimized. These weren't just good public relations. They were expressions of a genuine belief that power carried responsibility, that those who rose from a community owed something back to that community. That true kingship meant service, not just dominion. Bumpy Johnson was no saint, but in a world that offered Black Americans few opportunities and even fewer protections, he carved out a space where his people could thrive. And he defended that space against all comers, including the most powerful criminal organization in America. The night Bumpy walked into Frank Costello's office lives on in the stories told throughout Harlem and beyond. Some details have been embellished over the decades. Some facts have blurred into legend, but the essential truth remains clear. One man, armed with nothing but his intelligence and his reputation, faced down an empire and won. He didn't win through violence. He won through strategy. He didn't win by being the most dangerous man in the room. He won by being the smartest. He didn't win by threatening destruction. He won by demonstrating that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. This is the lesson that Bumpy Johnson's life teaches. Power has many forms. The most sustainable power comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the ability to create value that others want to share. Bumpy created value for Harlem. He created stability, protection, and economic opportunity. And because he had created something valuable, he had something to negotiate with. Frank Costello recognized this. He respected it, and he agreed to terms that would have been unthinkable with any other opponent. That's what made Bumpy Johnson legendary. Not his violence, his vision. The photograph stayed in Bumpy's possession for the rest of his life. Not the ones in the envelope. A different photograph, taken years later, showing him and his wife Mamie at a Harlem social event. He kept it framed in his home as a reminder of what he had fought for. Not money, not power, family, community, dignity. The right to walk through his own neighborhood with his head held high. The right to be treated as a man in a country that so often denied Black Americans their humanity. Frank Costello had understood this in that smoke-filled office in 1952. He had seen past the gangster to the man beneath, and he had respected what he saw. Two kings from different kingdoms, finding common ground in a world that said they should be enemies. That was the true legacy of their meeting. Not the business arrangement, not the territorial agreements, but the recognition that respect transcends race, that intelligence transcends circumstance, and that a man's worth is determined not by where he comes from, but by what he builds with the life he's given. Bumpy Johnson built a kingdom, and he defended it with the only weapon that truly matters, his mind. This story raises a question that still matters today. Bumpy Johnson walked into that room with no gun, no army, just information and unshakable confidence. He bet everything on being smarter than his enemy. What would you have done in his position? Would you have trusted your mind over a weapon? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. More untold stories of legends who refuse to bow are coming. Don't miss them.